Hello. Please do not swear. So Adam, automation, capitalism, all of that.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Thomas. I think it was outlined very well the context of this discussion, which is becoming increasingly something in the mainstream media, not just being discussed by those on the left, but this question of basically the fear of technology, which, when you think about it, is quite contradictory. I mean, you'd think one of the main indicators, really, of progress in society would be the question of how much wealth you can produce with how much work you need to put in. And yet we've got a situation here where the more automation we have, the more technology we develop, the more that we can do with less, actually, instead of inspiring confidence and a feeling of progress in society, it's actually creating these fears, this idea that we're in a race against the machines. And so we see this situation where, you know, there's this abundance of potential and technology out there, 3D printing, AI, machine learning, this Internet of Things that they call it. All of these things, we see the potential around us. And yet the actual reality, obviously, is one of stagnation in terms of society, in terms of the economy, ecological crisis, eye-watering and ever-growing inequality. And you just have to look at the statistics to see that it's patently clear that actually the vast majority of people have not benefited from the scientific and technological advances in society. In the US, for example, just some growth figures to give. From 2000 to 2011, productivity grew by an average of 2.5% per year, but real wages in the same period grew by only 1.5% per year. So, and you can see very clearly on these graphs, huge, you know, in every country basically, as GDP goes up, wages, basically real wages, effectively have been stagnant for not just the last 10 years, but for decades actually. And in all countries, the share of wealth going to labour has actually decreased, even in not just in the advanced capitalist countries like Britain and Germany and the USA, but also in the emerging economies, as they call them, in China and Mexico and so forth. So it shows it's a global problem, effectively, what we've got, where increased productivity is not increasing living standards. And all of this, we have to say, ultimately comes down to the nature of the capitalist system. The responsibility for these, for this technological fears and so forth actually comes down to the nature of capitalism. And we have to start by defining what we mean by capitalism. It's a system of production for profit, of competition, and where the main levers of the economy are held in private hands, private ownership over the means of production, as Marx would call it. And Marx pointed out that all value in society ultimately comes from labour and from the nature around us that our labour acts upon. And the surplus value in society is that value above and beyond what is paid back to the working class in the form of wages, and that is the source of profits. And really, that is it's the drive to increase those profits, to increase surplus value, that is the motor force behind capitalism. It's what made capitalism in its heyday a very progressive system. Marx even was the first to admit that capitalism had accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, put all former exoduses to shame. These were Marx's own words in the Communist Manifesto, and he highlights in his writings, and particularly in Capital, the role that machinery or technology or automation, whatever you want to call it, but he talks particularly about machinery, the role that plays within this process, where basically the capitalists could increase their profits by squeezing the working class even harder, forcing them to work harder, forcing them to work longer. But Marx says, look, that's not really in the long term a way of advancing society. There's only 24 hours in the day, and if you squeeze workers too hard, you'll push them to beyond their physical limits and destroy the working class itself. And so you see that historically the real motor force of the development of capitalism was trying to extract more wealth from each individual unit of labour in terms of every hour worked per person. And that's what he meant by productivity, the idea of how much surplus value you could produce for a given amount of wage inputs that you had to put in, and or an hour for every hour of labour that you put in. And the nature of capitalism, this drive for profits, was such that individual capitalists were constantly trying to invest in new technology to try and produce more for less, to try and basically lower their costs of production for every unit of any commodity that they were producing. And by doing this, they hope to be able to then sell below the market average. And if you can do that as a capitalist, you could put your competitors out of business, you could gain a greater market share, and through that process you see free competition turning into its opposite, turning into monopolies, where you get these bigger and bigger industries, economies of scale, and a handful of capitalist corporations dominating any particular sector. But the real problem that you see with capitalism is that actually all of this happens in a very anarchic and unplanned way because of the nature of capitalism. As you said, it's individual ownership over the means of production. And this investment in new technology is not being done to obviously to improve our living standards or to meet our needs or anything like that. It's being done fundamentally to try and increase profits from the point of the capitalist. And therefore, the whole process of technological development does not develop in a planned way, in a rational way, but actually in this anarchic and chaotic and very contradictory way. In fact, the capitalists themselves even have a name for this. Schumpeter, who's one of the main kind of Austrian school of economists, he invented the phrase creative destruction was his way of describing how this process occurs. In other words, rather than investing in new technology kind of in a way that's harmonious with our needs as society, where you allocate people from one job or one sector to another as industries become obsolete and redundant. No, instead he said what would happen is old industries, the uncompetitive ones, the unproductive ones, would go out of business. That would free up capital, free up labour, and the invisible hand of the market would then push these resources, both human and physical, into the new productive sectors. And that's the point, is that under capitalism this is done. It's not done with any kind of general plan in society. It's done on the basis of each individual capitalist pursuing their own rational aims. But the point is that what's rational for each individual capitalist, when you take it as a whole, is very irrational for the system as a whole. Because what you have is these new technologies are being brought in effectively to replace labour with machines, to push down wage costs and try and increase profits by automating and so forth. And the result is, when each individual capitalist does it, it makes sense from their point of view. You know, they're increasing their profits, but what they're hoping is that while they're doing that and pushing down the wages and increasing their profits and producing more and more goods, they're hoping that all the other capitalists are carrying on employing lots of workers on very high wages so that they can carry on buying all the goods that capitalism creates. But obviously they're all doing this at the same time, and the result is kind of like capitalism soaring away at the very branch that it sits on. You've got a situation where, as all the capitalists fall over themselves, accelerate more and more to try and increase their profits, you create this mass, what even the bourgeois have named technological unemployment, the idea of unemployment due to machinery basically replacing labour. And in fact, the result of it is that those who are left in work or left looking for work have a downward pressure put on their wages, in the sense that obviously there's this race against the machine, as they call it, and therefore those who are left looking for jobs are forced to accept lower and lower wages, worse and worse conditions, and this is what Marx called the reserve army of labour, this massive unemployment which put a downward pressure on wages. And it's for that reason that I think you get these fears about technology, not because people are against progress. It's often you hear this term Luddite being used, and that was referring to a movement, I think in the 18th century, maybe even earlier, of workers who went around smashing up the early weaving machines, what they called
Looms.
Looms. Sorry, yes, early looms, because they could see that these looms were taking their jobs, basically, as far as they were concerned. So they went smashing up, and you see a similar kind of fear today, whether it's the miners' strikes protesting against the closure of the coal mines, or the rebellion against the idea of getting rid of Trident. There's workers who they don't necessarily support the idea of nuclear weapons, but if you're working on these nuclear ships that provide thousands of jobs for your community, then you're against obviously those being scrapped, and it shows it's a reaction against this kind of anarchic invisible hand, where you can clearly see that potential other jobs do exist, that with the same skills, the same technology, people could easily be transferred to new productive industries. In fact, there's a famous case study of some workers in a place called Lucas Arms, or Lucas Aerospace, I think it was called. And it was an industry making primarily weapons, basically, various types of arms and aerospace industries and so on. And the workers in that own factory, they themselves came up with a plan using the same technologies they had in the factory, the same skills they had, of socially necessary things that they could be building with the same equipment. And it shows how, if workers have control over these things, if it's not just left up to the market, that workers, and especially if it's put under a rational plan of production on a national scale, they could very easily come up with alternatives for their own skills that don't rely on producing nuclear weapons and so forth. But going back to this fundamental question of this technological employment, this race against the machine, what you've got is now, obviously, as automation accelerates, and it accelerates ever quicker. The Moore's law, for example, shows how computing power doubles roughly every 18 to 24 months, and so and with the development now of deep learning, as they call it, you've got artificial intelligence able to basically, you've got robots replacing not just manual labour anymore, but sweeping through even middle class industries and protected professions, accountants and lawyers and so forth, and even doctors. You can get this health apps on your phone now, which are the first step towards basically a doctor in your pocket, effectively. And there was an industry report, or an academic report actually, by some people at Oxford, who predicted that by 2030 in America, 47% of jobs could be automated. And many of those, the technology is already there to automate them. You see, obviously, the development of driverless cars, and truck drivers obviously make up a very large sector of jobs in some states in the US. And all of these obviously face the threat of basically being permanently obsolete. But the contradiction from the perspective of capitalism is twofold, because on the one hand, you've got to remember, as we said at the beginning, that at the end of the day, it is workers themselves, it's their labour that produces all value. If you don't have labour involved in the productive process, there is no value produced, and there's no profit produced, there's no surplus value produced. And therefore, capitalism kills the goose that lays the golden egg, if you like. By replacing workers with machines, you get rid of the very source of your profits. You can see this even already today in the digital economy, where things like music and so forth, which are infinitely replicable now with MP3s, effectively should have a zero cost. I mean, if something's infinitely replicable and you can just just produce an infinite amount for no extra cost, then effectively the price under the laws of basic supply and demand should actually fall to zero. But obviously that would in turn destroy the whole source of profits for the music industry, for people like Apple and Google, who are selling these things through the iStores and so forth. And so the only way they can maintain their profits is actually by destroying the very laws of capitalism, by creating monopolies where you have intellectual property rights and copyright and things like that that actually protects their ability to sell above the actual real value, the actual cost of production. So that is one way in which you can see capitalism's contradictions coming through in this modern digital automated economy. The other, obviously, is, as I said, if you have this mass unemployment, at the end of the day, it's the working class and their wages that form the vast majority of the market for the goods that capitalism produces. And so you get, as more and more laid off, more and more technological unemployment, more and more do you get this crisis of overproduction, as Marx called it, where the working class is fundamentally unable to buy back the goods that they themselves are producing as part of the capitalist system. And it brings to mind a very kind of humorous tale, likely apocryphal, but nevertheless demonstrates the point of apparently there was, so the tale goes, Henry Ford, the owner of the mass production Ford company, was being shown round one of his factories by the trade union leader who was in charge of the workers of that factory. And he saw these wonderful new machines that were automating all of the mass production of cars and so forth. And he turned to the trade union leader and says, "How are you going to get those robots to pay your union memberships?" And the union leader turns around quick as a flash and says, "Yeah, but how are they going to buy your cars?" And that's the fundamental contradiction that you see creeping in more and more with this question of automation. And that's why, as Thomas alluded to, you have all these desperate attempts to kind of resolve the problem with things like UBI, Universal Basic Income, the idea that somehow you're going to convince the capitalists to actually just part with their wealth that they're generating from all of this, and just suddenly increase the taxation on these people.
Is it okay if we take a couple of chairs because we're a couple of chairs short now?
And you're gonna have a situation where, yeah, basically the hope is that somehow, despite the capitalists going to all sorts of extraordinary lengths to avoid tax as it is, with all sorts of farcical tax avoiding schemes, you've got nevertheless a kind of hope on the left that the situation is so desperate that these people will just kind of voluntarily part with their cash in order to provide everyone with an unconditional universal payment. But at the same time, we can see how this UBI is actually being used even by proponents on the libertarian right as an excuse to basically slash away the welfare state. The idea being that, you know, it's much more efficient to get rid of a whole load of civil servant bureaucrats who are administering welfare and benefits, and instead just pay everyone the same amount, with the benefit that even the millionaires and the billionaires get a few extra £1,000 in their pocket, whilst those actually who rely on benefits at the moment probably end up actually being worse off under that system. But it shows the question of UBI, what it really shows is how it exposes all those contradictions. The idea that we've got all this increased wealth in society, and yet it does not equal rising living standards. Instead, you have these stupid contradictions of cash piles in the hands of the rich alongside charity for the 99%, where you've got homelessness and empty homes, where you've got, you know, a vast improvement in technology and productivity, and yet we actually work harder, we work longer, we have more precarious existence, and the vast majority have not benefited. And I think, you know, what you see also is really, I think what all of this reflects is that even the mainstream economists now are recognizing the limits of capitalism, if you like, although obviously they'll propose anything but the solution itself, which obviously is to get rid of the source of the problem of capitalism and the private ownership of means of production of this profiteering market-based system. You have this incredible pessimism actually amongst the bourgeois, amongst these the more advanced or kind of far-sighted economists, where on the one hand they're worried about this idea of the robots taking all our jobs, but on the other hand there's enormous fears at the moment that productivity is actually stalling. And in fact in Britain, since the crisis in 2008, productivity has gone backwards, where actually precisely because of this mass unemployment and people being forced into things like the gig economy, you're actually having a situation now where it's you know, because of this huge downward pressure on wages that automation has created, globalization and the attacks on the working class from Thatcher and Reagan and through to the modern era created. All of this has created this huge downward pressure on wages, which means from the perspective of capitalism, it's actually cheaper to employ an army of low-cost labour than it is use your money to invest in machinery. And Paul Mason, in his book Post-Capitalism, actually provides an interesting example of this, where he says, you know, in the past, if you drove your car, so you wanted to wash your car, you would drive into a car washing machine. But now it's much more likely you'll go down the road where there'll be a team of very precariously employed migrant labour on dirt cheap, below minimum wages, who will do the job instead. It shows how, you know, a very small snippet, but I'm sure you can find many other examples where, well, just even the nature of a lot of the kind of manufacturing today, where it's rather than obviously produce with machinery and productivity, you instead have it offshored to the places where where wage costs are lowest, where health and safety and so forth doesn't get in the way of the profits as far as the capitalists are concerned. So it actually shows how capitalism itself, having previously been a motor force to the development of technology and science and industry and so forth, the development of productive forces, as Marx called it, now you've got this situation where actually it's become a barrier to the development of those productive forces, where capitalism cannot utilise the productive forces it has at its disposal. We have the potential to automate and to employ all this technology, but it doesn't happen. Instead, it's actually cheaper from the perspective of capitalism to exploit the working class even more brutally and instead let all this potential go to waste. So what we really see is that, therefore, under capitalism, as Marx said, we have this situation where you have accumulation of misery at one end and accumulation of profits and wealth at the other. That's the nature of the capitalist system, and as it always has been. And Marx accurately described this situation where now we've become an appendage of the machine, he called it. You know, rather than us being liberated by technology, we've become enslaved by it. And at the same time, as I say, it shows you all the potential for fundamentally running and planning society in a completely different and revolutionary way, where obviously under socialism you wouldn't have this forced idleness that you have under capitalism. That's the reality. Unemployment is not a choice for people. It's forced idleness. It's not freedom, if you like. Whereas under socialism, you would have voluntary leisure. You'd be able to utilise all of this technology, all of this machinery to share out the work and to actually lower the hours of the working week. And in turn, if you like, that would be you'd have what they always imagined in the science fiction of the past, where actually you read science fiction writers a century ago. They thought that the biggest problem facing humanity today would be that we'd have too much leisure time. We'd be bored, basically. That's the biggest problem we'd face. I think, obviously, all of us can see today that boredom is far from the biggest problem that any of us have. And instead, obviously, the hours of the working week are increasing. And but here you've got the potential to lower the hours of the working week, to not just by a small amount, but to drastically cut the amount of time that we need to work. And obviously, remove that barrier to the investment to increase productivity even further, to reduce the hours of the working week even further still. And there's no reason why you can't imagine under socialism a society where you genuinely had work effectively eliminated altogether. That's the point as Marxists. We're not trying to just share out misery and share out drudgery. You know, that's not our aim. Our aim is to eliminate the drudgery of work altogether, and actually, in turn, then provide a material basis for a genuine democratic society where you have the hours of the working week spare to be able to participate in politics, in community activism, in community organising, and to educate yourself about the priorities for society and so forth, to discuss with your peers and decide the way forwards. And I think that potential there, you can see it, and I think it's really for us it should be one of the most important agitational tools to show how capitalism has fundamentally failed. And Engels described it very well. He said that socialism, taking over these main levers of the economy, putting them under collective ownership, what I guess you call today full luxury automated communism, I think is the phrase there's some buzz on memes on the internet. But he said that this kind of society would mean the leap from the kingdom of necessity, where currently we've mastered over nature, but at the same time we're still under the kind of invisible hand. We're still not mastery over the economy that we've created. He said no. Instead, you have this leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom, and I think it's our task to really make that dream a reality by fighting for revolutionary change. So I open up for discussion. Thank you very much.
So, if anyone wants to make any points, questions, that type of thing, yeah. Oh, so if you can say, yes, I better wait another. Yes, well, so if you can just say your name.
Okay, awesome.
Right
I'm Hawk. Two questions. The first question is, in the long term, when technology does take over a lot of labour, UBI does seem like the logical way forward because of the contradiction of capitalism. But in the short term, medium term, 30, 50 years, that kind of period, surely the focus is on ensuring that people who have lost their jobs are given a chance to government intervention or companies who have employed them to retrain into different emerging sectors in different industries, as opposed to just sacking and getting rid of their workers. Surely that's the focus, is in making sure that people develop new skills for new industries, because the immediate jump to UBI may seem too, I guess, radical in the short term. I don't know, I might be wrong, but go for it.
Anyone want to make any points on that? Yep, and see you.
I suppose, I guess the problem might be that it costs money to retrain people, and if we're en masse having to retrain people, that's going to cut into the profits the capitalists are already scared to cut into, because it's already going to slow down production as it is. And I suppose the other problem is, that's not going to avoid the problem. That's saying if successfully capitalists have trained price people for UBI and such, we're still going to have a situation where there will be further automation to labour, and then capitalists have to do it again. And then I guess thirdly, you'd be retraining people to become more technically proficient, to be doing more advanced forms of labour, but I think they'll probably all be collectively still less well off. You'd probably have people who are very proficient but are just as well off as people in the past, which might almost just strike us as absurd. You've got people who are near scientists in their capacity to work on more and more advanced jobs with more and more advanced requirements, but are still being paid just the same as people were in the past, which I imagine would be the consequence of that.
May I ask this question?
Go for it, yeah.
Is it possibly cultural? There could be a cultural element to this, because I'm aware that in Japan, and there's a concept called lean thinking, where companies are encouraged to never sack their employees despite whatever the technological developments are, and they're encouraged to always keep them and always retrain them. And is it necessarily a cultural thing in the West and in the East, say? And I don't know.
Does anyone else want to contribute for me?
Yeah, what's your name?
Tor.
Tor.
It's a weird name, but I think the problem with this one is that how fast can they retrain people? In the sense that the system is changing so quickly. Is it really viable to retrain people every 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, every year into a new job? And in that scenario, you do need something like UBI just to keep people going.
Yeah, that links into Moore's law, the idea that every 2 years or whatever, computer power doubles, and there's a similar thing for robotic power and the like. So an exponential increase like that would have to retrain people faster and faster, and there'll become a point where it just won't be feasible, I imagine.
Yeah. Any other points, questions?
Just continuing to respond as well. I think so. I mean, yeah, there will be definitely cultural factors that might determine. Like, for example, some bosses of some companies might be culturally disposed to want to retain their workers, maybe out of a sense of goodwill, perhaps, for example, a general sense of like community. But it still doesn't change the fact that obviously companies need to generate profit, and if these workers are unproductive in the sense of that they've been rendered redundant by technology, either you've got to invest a lot of money into retraining them, which again costs a lot of money, costs profit margins, or you've got to retain them to do jobs which are redundant, which again is not producing you any more value and is again cutting into profit margins. And I guess you can't, as a firm, afford to be cutting into your profit margins to that extent because it will make you less competitive, which means you'll go out of business. So I suppose that would be the problem, I guess. It would eventually just make you a very bad capitalist and then you'll just sink you.
One of the things is that I think it's worth assuming as well that will people be happy being retrained constantly? Because I think obviously one fundamental thing about traditional capitalism is that you have a job, you have it for a long time, that's part of your identity. I think the faster you retrain people, move them around, the more they become alienated from themselves, and they see themselves more as a unit of labour, basically.
I think the thinking behind what I was saying about lean was it's like a 30-year concept, and it's more done with Toyota and companies like that in Japan, and I think it's more relevant to their culture. But one of my modules is in lean, and the concept is that some companies do practice this constant retraining, and because they think that you mentioned Henry Ford and the way he standardization of labour combined with division of standardization and division of labour combined meant that people basically had really boring jobs of just fitting bits to cars, the same thing over and over again, constantly. And what he did at the time was he paid them $5 a day, which was about double the wage of any other company, and they're really happy with that. But after about 10 years of that, kind of productivity decreases, and that basically meant the complete demise of the American automotive industry about, not recently, but about 20, 30 years ago, compared to Toyota. And so there is a case that continuously making sure your employees are always kept to think of new things and encourage, and kind of not like an us and them mentality, but a kind of we're in it together mentality can work. I don't know whether it can be applied to all companies, but yeah, I guess.
Yeah, sorry to keep on this question, but that's a really good point actually. So I think this is kind of one of those things where, interestingly enough, you kind of see the kind of solutions to problems emerging in capitalism. What I'd argue is that due to the fact that capitalism exists in the form of competitive firms, as private ownership of the means of production can't fully utilise that. So that's what you're talking about, like Fordism, basically, and that kind of Fordism is still retained in various Asian countries, basically. And it does, I guess it continually enriches the worker, makes them more technically proficient, makes them a more effective worker, etc., etc. I suppose, again, the problem is, almost reiterating the same point here, because it's a private business that is competing with other businesses and must maintain a certain amount of value for itself to reinvest and expand and such, that Fordism, or the advantage of that Fordism, I suppose, can't be fully utilised. I suppose the claim is in a socialist society, if we collectively own the means of production, we're not seeking to continually re-expand enterprise, we're only producing to meet demand. So we can have that kind of capacity to reinvest in ourselves and develop ourselves to meet the changing conditions of technology, but only insofar as we need to, not to keep the economy afloat because we're in competition with some other firm.
Adam, would you have any points to contribute on the whole idea about how does retraining constantly fit into the capitalist economy and that type of stuff? I mean, surely at some point the capitalist level does have to find new workers to now use the updated machines to some extent.
Well, I agree with Paul's point. I think it's going to become increasingly difficult to keep up with retraining as far as the capitalists can. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, at the moment, the capitalists are already basically unable to retrain for us. I mean, look at what's going on to education right now. They're slashing it to pieces all over the place, right? Fees are going up exponentially, effectively, from the sense that, 5 years ago you paid 3,000, a few years before that it was 1,000, now it's at 9,000 and something or other, and they're talking about unlimited fees. So the capitalists clearly aren't willing to pay for that education that they then benefit from in terms of profitability and so forth. So I find it a nice idea that suddenly they would turn around and be like, oh, actually now we're going to retrain everyone. But I think the point we'd say, yeah, we're in favour of retraining and lifelong education and so forth. But capitalism can't even provide 3-year-long education, let alone lifelong, right? And so we say, yeah, we're in favour of that. But in order to do that, you need to plan society in a rational way. You need to have a socialist society that actually places education as a need for society as a whole and for the development of the individual, not as just capitalist firm A needs educated worker B to fit into slot C, as a cog in the machine. It's I think that the question of education, therefore, it has to be put on a class basis, like we do with any analysis as Marxists. We don't look at it these things in the abstract, but look how society runs, in whose interest, who really makes the decisions, and for what purpose. Not for the needs of society, not for the good of individuals, but for their own bottom line. And actually, I was just reading this interesting book in advance of this talk, and for a couple of articles I've been writing, called The Economic Singularity. And it's by an author he's not a Marxist, he's not a socialist, I dare to say he's even necessarily that left-wing, but he basically admits that, and he does a whole kind of literature review of all the other economists in his field, and he says, look, actually we're going to get to a situation where education simply cannot keep up, and the economic singularity, as he calls it, is that point where basically automation is occurring so quickly that workers are thrown onto the scrap heap far faster than you can get back off it, if you like. And he says, this situation is going to happen in the next 20 years, basically, at the rate of originally they thought driverless cars were going to happen, in 10 years' time. Now I think Tesla and Elon Musk are saying, no, it's going to be in the next 2 years, basically. And in fact, they've already done tests that, of thousands of miles driven by these cars. So. And that's just one industry, but it's a very big industry, the truck driving and so forth. So as machines start to sweep through, like I say, 50% of jobs by 2030 was this study from some Oxford economists, and there's others similar for other that other academics have produced. So I think the idea of education and retraining will only go so far, and even then, who's going to do it? The other thing, I think, in terms of UBI, I actually just wrote an article on this week and put it up online this morning, where the main point I was trying to get at in it is I don't think it's a realistic demand, and I think B, it's not demanding enough. And I know that sounds like a contradiction, but as they say, be realistic, demand the impossible. I think UBI actually is quite naive as a demand, because, as I said, it's hoping that in a period where the capitalists are already not paying the minuscule levels of tax that we demand of them as a society, when they're already, you've got Apple paying an effective tax rate of something like 0.001% or something like that, and then the Irish government actually said, no, don't pay us more tax because it'll discourage other businesses from coming here. When you've got that kind of situation, I think it's slightly utopian to expect the kind of 10 percentage point increases in terms of tax that you require to fund even a basic level of UBI for everyone. It seems like utopian. The other point that I think is important, Marx makes this point in several of his writings, but particularly in one called The Critique of the Gotha Programme, where he criticises the reformist socialists who are around him. He says, look, you're putting too much emphasis on the question of distribution. Socialism is not about distribution. Socialism is about understanding production. He says the reason you have unequal distribution in society, the reason you have inequality, is because you have uneven distribution of the means of production. In other words, the very production, we're not concerned as Marxists about simply how we distribute the wealth that's already been created. We're concerned about how we have common ownership over the means by which new wealth is created in society. If you solve that problem, Marx says, if you have common ownership over the production of wealth itself, then you will automatically have much more equal society. Capitalism, by its nature, because it has private ownership over the means by which wealth is produced, that necessarily leads to inequality. Capitalism is an inherently unequal system because the profits of the few rely on the exploitation of the many. You can't get rid of inequality without getting rid of profits, which means not getting rid of capitalism itself. So our demand should not be for kind of any sort of radical change of taxation and distribution. Our demand as socialists should be for common ownership over the means of production, over the key levers of the economy, the banks, the big industries. You've got these, Silicon Valley monopolies. Well, let's nationalise them. Let's take them into public ownership, and then you don't have to worry about having some elaborate new-fangled system to distribute the money. Automatically, then all that massive amount of wealth that they're producing would go into the public purse and be able to raise the standard of living for everyone. And the other important point on that, just before I open it back up for discussion, is Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary, made a really important point as well when he was criticising Stalinism. He said, and I think it's the same in terms of criticising capitalism, he says, our fundamental problem with capitalism, it's the fundamental evil, he said, of capitalism, is not that there is inequality. He said that's a secondary question. Actually, our real problem with capitalism is that in order to maintain that inequality, the ruling class subjugates the whole of society to stagnation and decay and anarchy in terms of the fact that because you have production for profit, because they're exploiting the vast majority of people through private ownership, they don't invest the huge amount of money they've got, and you can see that today, right? The big business has plenty of money they could be investing in to take society forwards, to develop more automation, more machinery, more robots and so on. But actually Apple alone sits on $200 billion that it doesn't spend. Why? Because it's not profitable for it to. It's basically created the best phone it can create, and there's no advantage to investing any more money. And so it just sits on that. And big business as a whole across America sits on something like $2 trillion of cash. In other words, money that it could spend tomorrow. So it's not a question of the money's not there, or there's obviously things we need, but it's the whole nature of the system is what consigns us to this kind of stagnation, this evil. And I think therefore we have to emphasise for us the main question is about the key levers of the economy, who controls them, that class question. We shouldn't be so obsessed with taxation, I think.
Okay, any other points?
Got a question on cooperatives.
Go for it.
So cooperatives are when all the employees basically share the profits. And what's your view on that in terms of the capitalist system? And you just mentioned nationalisation of big firms and all that, but what's your view on cooperatives?
I'd be interested to hear other people's views first. I don't want to monopolise the conversation.
If no one's interested, I wouldn't mind giving my opinion. What we see with cooperatives is, I don't know too much about the exact working, etc., but it's very, very rare in which the profits are actually evenly distributed across all of the employees. It doesn't really have any, let's say, the big investors who, let's say, put a lot of money in, expect the returns on their investments. So unless actually all the employees were putting in their own effort, actually, they still wouldn't even be getting out those profits after they've all gone to the other capitalists, the financiers, the big banks, etc., who all want to take a part of the profit which comes from it. But actually, in Lenin's Imperialism and High Stage Capitalism, he kind of says, to really massively oversimplify, in Marxist day, it was true that an individual capitalist would come and turn out and exploit the worker, but by the time you start to actually see monopolies and big finance systems develop, it's far more that the banks as investors, are the people who are actually taking all the profits. Many of the actual capitalists either turn into that sense, but the actual managers usually just get paid a wage like anyone else. But I think the main thing is, even let's say you did have this type of cooperative spring up where everyone was paid directly to what they produced and put in, and the profits were shared completely equally. To actually still maintain those profits under a capitalist system, you'd still be disciplined to the rules of capital. You'd still have to actually pay workers, quite low wages, continually exploit them to make sure that effectively you could keep selling the commodities at the same price as all the other markets. So, let's say if you're paying your workers a good wage and then another capitalist comes along and doesn't and cuts costs massively, then effectively, it's your loss that your things are now more expensive, no one buys them, and you go out of business. So you'd have to continually rediscipline your workforce, and you continually see the same problems come out which emerge from the capitalist system.
Yeah, I'd want to say it's the function of trying to maintain profitability that causes exploitation. So you'd have in a cooperative a kind of comical example of the workers abstaining from the great surplus they're producing because they need to put it back in so they can produce more, but they're not reaping the benefits of it. So a cooperative would just be an even more tragicomic example of the capitalist system.
Let me suggest an example. Say I did an internship recently and it was on producing technology for severely disabled people with locked-in syndrome and for them to communicate. And if I decided to manufacture that, I don't have to employ anybody, but I make a profit. But then by making a profit, I could then employ more people and encourage more research and develop more products. Surely that in itself is a good thing. Am I missing a point?
So
I probably am, aren't I?
no, I think so. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's like we produce a surplus and then we can reinvest that to expand it to meet for more people's needs, right? That's right. But I think the difference between saying like a socialist society and a capitalist society is that you've got many different competing firms. It's the idea of competition and profit as well. You've got competing private firms all trying to wrangle in on the same territory. So unless one's got a complete monopoly on the situation, and that actually has its own host of problems because you have tyrannical control of the situation. Unless one's got a monopoly in the situation, they're all undercutting each other. In order to undercut each other, they need to exploit their workers. Now, I suppose in a socialist society, we would only, we could decide what we do with that surplus. Do we need more machines? I don't know, those guys haven't got as much food as we do. Well, yeah, we do then, in which case. Or we might go, no, we don't, or we can increase our wages then. I suppose the point is you'd have democratic control over what you would do with the social surplus, whereas in a capitalist society, the capitalists are compelled in their competition with each other to keep reinvesting it in production, not for need, but to just stay afloat. That's the difference there. It's private ownership and profit.
I have a question. So a big point of your talk was going on about how automation and increasing technology just means that, makes people unemployed, decreases the amount of jobs that are available. But what we've seen in the past is that technology has created an awful lot of jobs. So a good example is software development. It employs loads of people. It's a very big area. So you've got Microsoft, Apple, some of the biggest companies in the world that 50 years ago simply wouldn't even have been imaginable. So my question is, why would this trend not continue? Why, say, in another 20, 30 years, would there not be massive sectors that we just can't imagine today?
Good question. What do others think of that one?
I think this is always an interesting point always comes up in these discussions, but I think that there is a qualitative difference in the type of automation we're seeing now. Firstly, in the sense that the automation we're seeing now is not it's not sort of going to produce secondary jobs in the sense that automation in the past, the classic example, bank tellers, bank tellers, ATMs or banks, but now the automation we're seeing is specifically designed to eliminate a job, in the sense that people they are making this technology thinking, how can we get rid of the most number of jobs possible? And secondly, obviously, the type of automation it is cognitive things. It's sort of thinking things. The things that in the past, as I said with bank tellers, or ATMs, but that's not really cognitive. These are the cognitive. This is the stuff that was left to us. And I think if you get rid of that, then it's not really anywhere else to go.
I see. Okay.
Anyone else who hasn't made a point? Want to speak now?
Does anyone have any more definitional questions as well? You don't have to necessarily have a complex contribution based on what's going on so far. Just anything more just clarify.
What jobs are you all hoping to get? Designing robots?
Obviously, it's a sensible thing.
I hope everyone's learning computer programming.
I know there was an article in The Economist where basically looked at how many, basically who was now getting paid the most. It basically said if you want to be employed, you should now know programming. So it's clear. So if you've got to this point in your educational career and haven't learnt it, it's too late. Doesn't matter. All the algebra, the writing, general just work, it doesn't matter.
That's why the government is introducing coding for primary schools and stuff.
But I think it is one of the, I think like Tor really hit the nail on the head. It's not like with this analysis we just think that machines are just going to put everyone out of work constantly. It's the fact that the machines being designed are ones to continually replace labour. They're not creating new jobs, not let's say creating a fleet that everyone can now go and become spacemen because we've all got rockets and we can all spend our time doing that. It is specifically designed to replace the worker, to make people unemployed. These aren't machines and technology being put towards creating employment, but often being put towards getting rid of it. I think, actually one of the really interesting things, if you look at the history of capitalist development, capitalism doesn't just make any old technology. The technologies it really invests in are things which can effectively increase its profits, increase the cycle of the cycle of capital. A really good example is, or quite a historical example, is actually where no one ever eats mutton anymore. Everyone eats lamb, because effectively in 1700s, etc., you could only produce a sheep to have enough thing when it got to full grown, therefore mutton. Capitalists were able to create new technologies, new breeding methods to speed that up. Suddenly everyone eats lamb, mutton's kind of put away. And this is the thing, is that technology is always orientated towards increasing profits. Once you don't actually have that, well then actually a whole new series of technology could develop. You could actually see things which aren't necessarily increasing your profit, but increasing the greatest social good. The internet initially was incredibly unprofitable and only really emerged because of work being done in the public sector by scientists to basically store loads of like data programs and records among each other. I think that is also one of the actual really liberating things which technology has progress to do. That isn't just about creating profit; it's about actually bettering people's lives. And do you want to come back on a few things with that?
Yeah, sure. I think the question of cooperatives was well answered. I think the point with cooperatives is of course, I should say this with the question of UBI as well. We support these demands in as so far as they help raise consciousness, in the sense that if you've got we've described the limits of cooperatives, if you like. If you had a load of workers overtake a factory down the road, you wouldn't be like, well, guys, don't want to ruin the party here, but you are in a market economy, and this isn't going to work out so well in the long run. So see you later. We're going to be at the Marxist society. That would be sectarianism to the highest order. So you would obviously participate in that struggle. You would obviously support it. You would obviously defend any attempts to abolish such a kind of workers' control of the factory. You support it primarily because it gives workers a sense of their own strength. It brings them together, develops a class consciousness, and from that makes it easier for other workers to take control of their factories and their workplaces. And then it becomes easier with that movement to raise our actual real demand, which is a question of public ownership combined with workers' control. And the one without the other makes no sense. If you have top-down bureaucratic planning, it's Stalinism. It doesn't work. If you have workers' control without nationalisation, then it's an island of socialism and a sea of capitalism. So you need the two together. They're fundamentally interlinked symbiotically. So we obviously fight for it. And the same with UBI. If you had a left-wing... In fact, I think John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, has proposed it as one of the Labour's key economic policies. I'm sceptical as to whether John McDonnell and Corbyn are still going to be leaders of the Labour Party within the next few weeks, given the shenanigans going on there at the moment. But that's a whole other discussion we can have in the bar. But nevertheless, and also the French socialist candidate, who's called the French Corbyn, Benoit Hamon, I think, and the Green Party in Britain as well. A lot of these people are raising it from a left-wing perspective. There are the libertarian types, like in India, who are trying to raise it more to get rid of the kind of pesky bureaucracy as they see it, and use it as an excuse to open up the world for privatisation and so forth. But there is a genuine left call for UBI, universal basic income, and that is, and I think, although I've said all its limits and why we don't think it's the fundamental solution, because it doesn't try and change capitalism, it tries to plaster over its sores and its symptoms. Nevertheless, you would support John McDonnell in Labour and the idea of trying to implement such a policy, but only, also we would say, not because we see it as the solution, but to help raise consciousness, to get the left into power, and to then highlight the limits of these things and actually the need to go beyond them. In other words, it's what we call a transitional demand. You raise it not as the end in itself, but as something that needs to be fought for to raise working class consciousness, but fundamentally linked to the question of nationalisation and workers' power. That is that's any demand any reform that we fight for as Marxists. It's always got to be linked to that fundamental question of transforming society along the socialist lines. So we do support these things. What Hock was it? You had a question about what's wrong with you having a private business and having your own kind of investment and research into benevolent things, and I think Barnaby answered that a bit as well. And again, it is fundamentally the problem with capitalism is that it actually, the competition, the production of profit, the private ownership, these fundamental tenets of capitalism actually become a barrier to the development of science. I mean, I used to be an environmental engineer doing research in university, and it was phenomenal how, even though we were a public body, we acted like a private one. We couldn't share our data with other universities, and they wouldn't share it with us. Why? Because there's a limited amount of funding going into engineering across the country. All the academics want to keep their jobs, all the PhD students want to keep their money, so you don't share it with someone else so they get the results out first and get all the funding the next time the grant comes around, so you hang on to it. And big business in the private sphere is even worse. Like, you have Apple suing Google, I think it was, because they tried to, Android, or Samsung it was, sorry, tried to use the double tap or something like this as a gesture on the phone that you could use, and they sued because of that. And you think, for God's sake, like, how can you sue a technique like that? Like, how can you patent something as fundamental as that? Which, if you've invented it, surely you'd want it to disseminate across all technology if it's really that good. But private ownership and intellectual property rights, which is private ownership over the intellectual sphere, it stands in the way of that, and I'm sure you might, Steve Jobs probably thought he was, Messiah Mark II. He I'm sure thought he was doing the world a great service in designing these wonderful things, but he probably wasn't a malicious man. Bill Gates, I'm sure, isn't a malicious man. I'm sure he's very nice to his family and he donates all his money to Africa and so forth. But at the end of the day, Microsoft still has enormous intellectual property teams of lawyers who go around suing anyone who tries to break their code, and they gobble up any small firm that stands in their way as well. So it's the nature of capitalism that's the problem. Jack asked a good question. Well, could technology create jobs just as well as destroying them, as it has done in the past? And that is the main capitalist argument in favour of, don't worry lads, it's going to be all right, and their basic thing is to say, well, look, once upon a time we had horses and now we have tractors, but in the meantime, you lost all these farm workers, but now they're all in the cities working in offices, and people got laid out of the factories and made unemployed, but now they're all in the universities or somewhere else. And this is the idea that there's always some other new jobs created by these processes. I think Tor outlined very well. And the question now is, what kind of jobs are they destroying? It's not just it's not manual labour anymore. It's mental labour itself. And these protected professions like lawyers actually are potentially going to be wiped out. Accountants, things like that. Doctors. There's whole ranges of even very educated, very privileged layers of society that are going to be swept up in all of this. Again, this is what the economics and singularity tries to imply, the idea that no jobs are safe anymore. And while you might get new jobs created, like the programmers, the people who design the computers and the robots, even those are dwindling in number. You know, you look at a lot of these Silicon Valley firms, the actual number of workers they employ is minuscule. I think WhatsApp and not WhatsApp, what's it called? Instagram. It's got like 100 workers or something like that, and it's basically valued at billions of dollars. You know, it's minuscule numbers of people creating enormous amounts of wealth, and that's why again you get such large inequality in society, because there aren't enough jobs to go around and all these things. And I think, just to sum up before opening up again, I think the thing we got to remember, and I think where a lot of these books like this fail, and a lot of the analysis you hear in the press about this question of automation fails, is that they divorce technology from economics and politics, and they divorce it from. They look at it in isolation as a bubble, as though, like, you know, technology is here now, right now, and it will just carry on getting better and better, and it's going to smoothly kind of, you know, everything's going to get better, and you know, tomorrow will be better than today, today's better than yesterday, and so forth. But as Marxists, we understand the interrelationship between all these different parts of society. We understand that actually, you know, material conditions are required to allow technology to take hold in society. A good example of that is actually the steam engine. Do you know when the steam engine was invented? Anyone want to guess?
Oh, I think I know this one. Isn't it about like 2000 BC? There's arguments in
Yeah,
Egypt.
the steam engine was actually originally invented by someone called Hero of Alexandria, who created it effectively as a toy. Okay, he had he worked out a way of powering little kind of steam train that would run, you know, go around basically. But it didn't get used, steam power, for millennia. Why? Because you had slaves. You didn't need to make slaves more productive. You just got more slaves. You had an economy that was built to just expand and expand and expand. You had war. The whole of the Roman Empire was just, and the Greek Empire before that, was just designed to soak up more and more slaves. And if a slave died, well, that was like your machine failing. You got a new one. You know, it was that slave meant a tool with a voice, effectively. And so it required actually capitalism to come in with wage labour, but actually these kind of productive technologies to take hold. Why? Because suddenly you've got this a special material set of relations now, where the worker is not a slave. You're not buying them, you're buying their time, and it's up to you to get as much wealth out of that time as possible, i.e. to make them as productive as possible. And that's the nature of capitalism that makes it fundamentally different, made it such a progressive system in its heyday, but all that, as I said, all that motor force of progression is now turned into its opposite. The other thing we've got to understand also is how this whole process ties in with the economics and the politics, because look at what's going on in the world today. You know, the world is more turbulent than it's ever been before. And where does that come from? Does it come from just machines? Well, actually, in some sense, yes. Like, look at Trump, look at Brexit. What's that about? It's about fears about jobs, you know, fundamentally, about the idea that migrants have stolen all our jobs, that globalization hasn't benefited, you know, the American dream. It's an American nightmare. And that's basically, I'd say, where Trump gets his basic support from. Not necessarily a conscious way, but that's effectively what he represents, the idea that we need to go back to some glorious time where all these jobs existed. The problem that no one seems to have told Trump is that it wasn't migrants who ever stole your jobs. It was robots, actually. Most of the jobs that have been lost in America have not been lost to China or to Mexico. They've been lost to automation and to increases in technology. And you can put up all the protectionism you like, but those jobs aren't coming back, and that's the reality. And it shows you how you're going to have before you have this kind of economic singularity and or any sort of utopian full automation that's just coming about smoothly. You're going to have a whole series of crises: economic crises, political crises, and geopolitical crises. You know, military crises, economic, ecological crises. You know. That's the nature of the period ahead of us. It's not going to be a smooth transition to full luxury automated communism, nor to some magical capitalism where we all benefit from this wonderful technology that's been bestowed to us by Adam Smith and his invisible hand. No, it's going to be a series of turbulent crises, one after another, where they all interlink together. The economic crisis of 2008 is what's leading into the political crisis now, and the political crisis of things like Brexit is making the idea of a next world slump even more likely. And I think in that situation, we've got to emphasise, that all of these crises that have at their common root capitalism, and it's only if you overthrow capitalism that you're going to get that utopia, basically.
I'd just like to say, really appreciate this talk.